if you don't have bank credit for the real economy, for productive business investment, you will get no growth. So that was likely to happen. So then my proposal was, I called it quantitative easing, and had two aspects. So the first policy recommendation, which we can call QE1, first type of QE, is for the central bank to step in and purchase the non-performing assets in the banking system, which is all essentially the excessive property lending. It's all going to turn sour because it's all money creation for speculative purposes. It's unproductive, unsustainable. Central bank buys it up at face value, problem solved. Banks have a strong balance sheet. But that won't be enough to get them to increase credit because they're still shell shocked because the problem was so vast in Japan. So I proposed QE2, the second version of QE, which allows the central bank to force the banks to create more money, push it into the economy. Namely, if the central bank buys assets from the non-bank sectors, because when a central bank buys something from the non-bank sector, the seller, say, of this property, how do they get the money? Well, the central bank will transfer it to their bank account, which means that suddenly they have money in their bank account, which actually the bank creates because it gets a booking in its reserve account with the central bank. So that's how it works. And that's how a central bank can push money into the economy directly. So these were the two forms of QE I recommended. Unfortunately, in Japan, I mean, they understood what I was saying, but essentially the story was, well, okay, great analysis, we'd love to do this, but the Americans are not allowing us. So Japan for 20 years didn't do this. But in 2008, when it happened in America, Bernanke said, oh, the Werner proposal, QE1, yeah, we'll do that. And they did it immediately. Whereas actually even in Europe, they didn't understand the finer details. They, QE, we have to do QE, just buy assets, anything. They bought performing assets from banks, which is marginally helpful, but it doesn't really do the job. And so it took much longer in Europe to get out of the 2008 crisis, whereas America was very quickly recovering because Ben Bernanke, who was part of these debates in the 90s on Japan, he was aware of my proposal and he purchased, the Fed purchased the non-performing assets close to face value from the banks. So the banks were suddenly in one go, fine. But they still didn't do the second recommendation because they deemed it not necessary. Fine. So it took 2 years for banks to then increase credit significantly, and then it was 6-7% bank credit growth, 2010-11, and they were doing fine. Now, 2020, March, what happened was the Federal Reserve adopted QE2 at a time when the economy was actually doing fine, growth was fine, bank credit growth was around 5-6%. There was no deflation. This was a recommendation for deflation and for a shrinking economy, and they did it. They did QE2, and there was a massive expansion. The Federal Reserve buying up private sector assets from non-banks, therefore forcing banks to create credit, and massive. I mean, it's just totally off the chart. It's the biggest in the post-war era. And at the same time, of course, there were government restrictions in 2020. So therefore, if you reduce supply, but you massively increase demand through money creation, putting into the economy this money, which in 2008 was just an accounting transaction. There was no new money, so it wasn't going to create inflation. But in 2020, it's very clear it's going to create inflation. So there's going to be inflation. Most commentators thought, because they don't understand these differences between QE, it's going to be fine. 2008, all this Fed QE, no inflation. It's going to be the same in 2020. No, it's totally different. It's going to be massive inflation. Now, the smoking gun is this. How do we know that this was fully the intention? Well, it's a very specific policy and it's very rarely taken. So, and all the central banks suddenly did it. Even the Bank of Japan, that for decades had been saying, we can't do what Professor Werner is saying. We can't do it. They did it in March 2020. So they can do it. But the other proof is just before COVID, in August 2019, there was a conference in Jackson Hole of That's the annual central bankers conference. But they'd invited BlackRock, the big asset manager, tens of trillions of assets under management, the biggest asset manager in the world. And BlackRock made a proposal. They said, there will be another crisis. Yeah, we can be sure of that because each time we reward the central planners for creating crises, so why wouldn't they have another crisis? There'll be another crisis, but this time we should create inflation. They never explain why. They just say, we must create inflation. Of course, it's a clever sort of psychological trick because the insinuation is unspoken. The crisis will be deflationary, therefore we must create inflation. Yeah. But, it could be just because we want inflation. They just don't say, but next time we must create inflation and here's how we're going to do it. And they cited my proposal, without mentioning my name, of course. We need to back fiscal policy through money creation and get the central bank to directly push money into the economy, which it can do by purchasing assets from the non-bank sector. And how do we know that this is what the Fed did in March 2020? Well, we've got the data, and there's one more factor. The Federal Reserve hired BlackRock in March 2020 to buy assets.